Hey everybody, welcome to the final lecture on our course, the week 6 overview lecture. This one's going to be a little bit different than the previous ones have been. This is not really an organized historical lecture. Basically what I wanted to do in this last week is just to kind of see where we've gotten in our 5 course themes. So I'm really going to be kind of less giving you a history lesson here and just kind of giving some food for thought about kind of where I think these themes have gotten us from where we started the course back in the 1860s and 1870s up to today. So I'm going to run through each course, just sort of make some observations, give you some thoughts to think about, to take away with the course, and hopefully stuff you've learned in this class will help you to continue to gain understanding of and of these themes and navigate the nation and the world we're living in today. The first theme I want to look at is technology and culture, which, because it's sort of the least conventional historical topic, I think, that we cover this semester, sometimes can get sort of short shrift. And it can be kind of, I think, hard to talk about something so amorphous. But what I wanted to kind of do is present a little bit of a thesis of something that I would say has been going on, at least in the last 100 or so years technologically, where that's gotten us today, and certainly something for us to think about as we move forward into the future. So as you maybe see from this picture, and I'll kind of run through these individually, I think one thing to think about in terms of technology and how it has influenced culture is this trend towards individualism, isolation, and often loneliness. I think if you think about how people, for example, entertain each other, for much of history, entertainment was live entertainment, right? If you wanted to experience music, you would either go see like a symphony or a band play, or you would, with your family, perhaps gather around the piano, sing songs together, something like that. Entertainment was inherently a communal experience. And I think technology has really chipped away at that idea in ways that are certainly can be very engaging, but I think have some dark sides as well. So, I mean, you can think all the way back to the 1920s with the radio. Now, very often, even the radio would be pretty communal, right? You could gather around with your family to listen to it, or even, I've read stories of people kind of walking down the street and hearing the same radio station, whether it's music or a baseball game or something like that, coming out of every window in the neighborhood. So there's something shared about the radio. But I think what we'll see is this tendency towards atomization. And with atomization can come isolation and alienation as well. So we go from the radio, to some extent, I think the television is an extension of that, although it's really inherently in the home. So you might watch it with your family, but often, especially as people got more than one television in their home, this could be an isolating factor as well. Even think about something that, again, for thousands of years was a communal shared experience, like dancing became a more individual experience, right? If you think about the way dancing would have been done for hundreds of years before the 20th century, you do it with a partner or in groups. But if you look at this picture on the right, this is from a movie called Saturday Night Fever. Some of you might be familiar with that. It's a movie about kind of disco culture in New York City in the 70s. But here we've got John Travolta dancing by himself on a lighted dance floor, and everyone else just sort of standing back and watching, right? So rather than dancing with a partner, he's sort of dancing by himself with this sort of look at me attitude. And so as entertainment technology expanded, and we got, for example, blockbuster films and stuff like that. Again, and going to a movie theater can be a communal experience, but as fewer and fewer of us go to the movies than we used to. I mean, the average American went a couple times a month for much of the period of motion pictures. Now, a lot of people, as you well know, watch movies at home on streaming services or whatever. So even the communal aspect of that has been at least eroded, if not lost, for a lot of people. And then you add to that something like cable television, where not only is it often pretty individual as an experience, but it's very tailored to your needs, right? For something like radio or movies, there's really only a few options, right? So there's a lot of shared culture. That was also true in the early days of television when there's only a few stations to watch. But now, like when I was a kid, cable meant like a few dozen stations. Now, of course, there's hundreds, probably thousands of cable stations, each of which is like targeted to your specific interests or needs or generating new interests you didn't even know you had. And so again, that can be a very individual experience as well. And then this really starts to be fulfilled, this trend towards isolation, individual entertainment with the internet. I'm old enough to remember the birth of the internet, and obviously the defining image of the internet is a person just sitting in a room by themselves on a computer. Now, of course, that has enormous utopian promise in some ways, right? The internet, I think, could have been very different than it is, where it was this kind of Wild West where people set up their own websites, and in those early days before Google, the internet was much more of a sort of exploratory experience where you're really trying hard to find stuff that fits your interests. There wasn't Wikipedia, there wasn't Google, there weren't all these things that were basically gigantic funnels that funnel you towards just a handful of ways to engage with internet content. And then, of course, the ultimate example of the atomization of communication and entertainment technology is the smartphone. I could go on and on. We all could. I'm sure we're all kind of sick of everyone talking about the cultural impacts of smartphones, but I really don't think it can be underestimated how different this is, where every single person, something like 95% of teenagers have smartphones, have this sort of personally tailored experience for them. So rather than go watch the same movie everyone else is watching at the same time, or rather than watching the same television show or sporting event or whatever with other people at the same time, every single person gets an algorithmically driven experience of reality. And this filters not only entertainment, but news, understanding of the world, all sorts of things. And I think this does have consequences. And I think in many ways, the human brain evolved to have, again, shared communal, community-oriented experiences. And now with so many people spending so much of their time with an individualized phone-oriented experience, it's having all sorts of really obvious and dramatic effects on people's experience of the world, mental health, stuff like that. For those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, there's a guy named Jonathan Haidt, H-I-E-D-T, who's a really interesting writer and scholar on some of this stuff. He has a book called The Anxious Generation. When I had my face-to-face class in the spring, I showed students an interview with him, and he's one of the people behind the effort to get smartphones out of high schools and stuff like that. He has enormous amounts of data about the psychological impact that stuff like the internet and smartphones have had, especially on younger people. And my students were really responsive to it. I wish I had a chance to talk to some of you about it. But I think a lot of people recognize that there are problems with all of this, right? There are negative consequences. The problem is, how do you get out of it, right? How do you not have a smartphone all your friends do, right? How do you not be on social media when that's where all your friends are? Stuff like that. But again, there's mountains of data to support that there's something troubling going on with all this. Here's just a couple charts. This is based on similar data to the data that Jonathan Haidt draws from. Very noticeable increases of anxiety and depression, especially among young people. Young people are obviously spending a lot less time in person with friends as well. So this trend towards isolation through communication and entertainment technology is also leading to isolation and actual human experience in people's daily lived lives. So I'm not here to solve this problem for you. I'm sure you've heard many lectures from many adults about all this stuff. I certainly don't have answers. But I think, if we're thinking about the big picture, what we talked about in this course, especially when it comes to technology and culture, all of this stuff has basically led us to this moment of, retreat from large, shared, public entertainment to this very atomized, isolated experience. And again, I think that's having all sorts of cultural and psychological consequences now and for the future. So again, this is not meant to be a formal history lecture, just sort of some food for thought about where our course themes have culminated by the year 2025. Another theme I want to look at is the United States and the world. I would say if we look at this whole course, the big story has just been the rise of the United States as a global power and now sort of the premier global superpower. If you think about along economic lines, cultural lines, military lines, the United States has been dominating global affairs for a really long time. And there are ways in which that is good, but I think it also comes with some challenges as well. If you think back to week 5, for a long time, the dominant structure of American foreign relations and foreign policy was the Cold War. And it's, while the Cold War could be scary, right? People were afraid of nuclear war against the Soviet Union and stuff like that. there was also this simplicity to it. This idea that the Cold War makes the world kind of easy to understand. There's us, and there's them, and there's everybody else, and everybody else is going to kind of pick a side. And so that in some ways makes the world simple. But with the loss of the Cold War, I think for about a decade or so, the United States was sort of scrambling to figure out, well, how do we think about the world now? How do we organize the world now? How do we think about our role in the world now? And I think the key event that sort of reoriented a lot of that was September 11th. I'm sure I've been doing this job long enough that I remember a time when this was a fresh memory for students. Now, a lot of you were born after this even happened. I was in New York City when September 11th happened. I watched those buildings fall with my own eyes. It was obviously an incredibly intense thing to experience. And of course, the aftermath totally transformed everything in American life, especially in America's role abroad. This led to the war on terror. This led to the war in Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of people died in those wars, mostly people from those places. It was unlike something like the Vietnam War, which I talked about in a previous lecture, where in the Vietnam War, Americans were bombarded with often horrific images of what was going on there. But for a lot of the time, the Iraq and the war on terror were going on in Afghanistan. I think American public life was pretty isolated from some of the horrors that especially people in those countries were experiencing. But for a long time, I think terror and the war against terror, global terror, kind of organized how America saw its role in the world, right? This idea that we're going to stamp out terror. But the problem was the United States was not particularly successful in that endeavor, right? Global terrorism didn't disappear. We didn't conquer that problem. And I think in a way, we're still in this moment of reorientation in terms of how the world's global affairs are going to be organized. Certainly the United States does and will continue to play a massive role in that story. One way to measure this is the United States has by far the biggest, most expensive military in the world. If you add up the next 10 countries combined, we spend more on our military than the next 10 countries combined, at least 10. I've seen that number as high as 12. So we clearly have this enormous global footprint. The United States has bases in dozens of countries around the world and a presence and even more than that. So there is, we can locate the term global policeman back to the Teddy Roosevelt era. And to a large extent still, the United States has this sort of global policeman role where, just like in the Cold War, if something is happening in the world, the United States has the responsibility, due to its global reach and power, to at least do something, right? Establish a policy, right? A lot of countries can kind of ignore what's going on in parts of the world, but the United States tends to get drawn into everything because our interests are so interconnected with those of the rest of the world. So I'd call your attention to three major sort of points of conflict that I think are likely to arise in the next couple years. If you think about the Cold War, where there was this sort of us versus them idea, I think in some ways we're gravitating towards a new version of that, although one that's not quite as bipolar as the Cold War was. Certainly, one looming rival is China. Right, China has the most people of any country in the world and an enormous economy as well. I don't know what's going to happen. I would say direct military conflict with China is probably unlikely, in the same way that direct military conflict with the Soviet Union never occurred during the Cold War. But I can envision all sorts of moments where, I think one hot spot a lot of people look at is the South China Sea, and in Taiwan, right? If China were to invade Taiwan and the United States were forced to take action, that could very easily blow up into a much larger global confrontation. Obviously, I think we should all be hoping that a global confrontation, military confrontation between the United States and China doesn't happen, because it could potentially be catastrophic. I think you could say the same thing about Russia. You can think about the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, America's support of Ukraine. That has kind of ebbed and flowed. We're kind of, again, in a weird transitional moment there, especially in the Trump administration, which in the early days of the second term seemed to be much more friendly to Russia and much more reluctant to support Ukraine. But even just in the last few weeks, the United States has continued to authorize support for Ukraine. But I think that's another global hotspot and another potential global rival to the United States, Russia. And then, of course, there's what's going on in Gaza with Israel's bombardment of Gaza after October 7th. The United States has militarily and materially supported Israel, despite enormous amounts of resistance and criticism here and abroad of what Israel is doing in Gaza. The Middle East, for a long time, this dates back to September 11th as well, has been a point of global contention that the United States is inevitably involved in and kind of forced to take sides in. So, again, I don't have a clear historical thesis to present here. What I would argue is that we're in this kind of transitional reorientation sort of a moment. And I think it's kind of hard to predict how this is going to play out. Global affairs are always hard to predict in terms of how they're going to play out. But we do have, I think, some alarming things going on around the world in the same way that, Korea or Vietnam or the Cuban Missile Crisis, something like that, was alarming back during the Cold War. It's worth noting that all the countries on your screen have nuclear weapons, right? China has nuclear weapons, Russia has nuclear weapons, Israel has nuclear weapons. There's other global hotspots like India and Pakistan. They have nuclear weapons. So, since 1945, we've had the prospect of nuclear war hanging over our heads. And in some ways, the potential horrors of nuclear war have helped avoid nuclear war, right? Nobody wants to be the country to use a nuclear weapon. But, you and I, we've got long lives ahead of us. We live in a complicated, dangerous world. And if those nuclear weapons start to go off, it's hard to imagine the level of catastrophe we could face. So, again, I don't have an answer. I can't make an accurate prediction of what's going on. But those are certainly areas to pay attention to as we think about America's role abroad. Third theme I want to touch on is the economy. If you think about our big course transformations of the economy, we start with the United States in this sort of industrializing moment in the Gilded Age. That continued to expand throughout the 20th century. But also in terms of the United States, a lot of our manufacturing capacity has either been automated or kind of outsourced abroad. But of course, the world still needs massive amounts of products and materials that are being produced. The global economy is insanely complicated. I'm not here to explain to you all the nitty gritty of how the global economy works. But if we think about the United States, again, for me, the dominant story that has been true in what we've covered so far in this course and will continue to be a really major factor as we move forward is this concept that you hear talked about a lot, which is the idea that we're living in a new Gilded Age. If you think back to the original Gilded Age in the late 1800s, one of its kind of dominant characteristics was just a huge gap between a small number of people at the top and a lot of people at the bottom struggling to get by. Again, in the middle of the 20th century, it kind of felt like we were successfully addressing that problem. In the middle of the 20th century, the middle class did grow. The gap between the wealthy and the poor got smaller. But really, since the late 70s and then accelerating rapidly in the 80s and accelerating rapidly again in the 21st century, we're actually back to levels of wealth distribution that are more unequal than they were in 1929, right before the Great Depression, and more unequal than they were in the Gilded Age. The level of day-to-day struggle that a huge fraction of Americans face versus the incredible wealth concentrated at the top is a really important thing to not ignore in modern American life. I put this picture on the screen just because I think it's kind of an interesting echo, right? Back in the Gilded Age, there's this idea that the, steel and copper and oil barons are overseeing American politics and kind of pulling the strings. The picture on the right is from Trump's 2024 inauguration. But now the industries are different, right? Instead of manufacturers who make steel and oil, it's Mark Zuckerberg, who runs Facebook. It's Jeff Bezos, who runs Amazon. I should have put his name. It's the guy, the third guy over is the CEO of Alphabet, which owns Google, Pindar, P-I-N-D-A-R. And of course, Elon Musk, who runs Tesla and was for a while there Trump's right-hand man early in this administration. So to a large extent, these are the kind of robber barons of today. These are people with tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars at a time when median American incomes for a family are like $50,000 a year or something like that. So the gap between the wealthy and the poor is enormous. Just about one statistic that I think is kind of an interesting illustration of this If you go back to the 1950s and you picture a company and you look at the median employee, right, like a middle tier employee, and then you look at the CEO and you look at how many more times does the CEO make than the median employee, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 25. So the boss of the company would make about 25 times more than a median employee, which is a lot. Today, that number's like 4 to 500. So today, for most large companies, the CEO makes something like 4 to 500 times more than the average employee at that company. Now, whether you think that's right or wrong, whether people deserve money or don't deserve it, that's sort of a personal thing. But what I would point to is something I pointed to back when we talked about the Great Depression, which is there is a really material consequence of this level of inequality, and that's that a lot of that money isn't being spent on stuff, right? We've got an economy that now runs largely on consumption. And if too many people have too little money to spend, that doesn't really support many areas of the economy. Meanwhile, if you've got someone with hundreds of billions of dollars that's basically just parked in the stock market, they're not buying stuff. They're not really supporting the consumer economy. And there's a very long historical understanding of the fact that many nations and empires crumble when the gap between the wealthy and the poor gets too large. Again, this dates back to ancient empires. This has been observed by historians over and over that a sign that an empire or a large nation is getting very creaky and in danger of collapsing, very often a warning sign of that is this extreme maldistribution of wealth. You can look at the screen here for just a kind of visual representation of this. You look at the bottom 50% of American incomes, which is probably where a lot of us are, barely have risen in the last 25 to 30 years. 50 to 90%, which is where I'm guessing all of us are, have seen some gains, are relatively small. Now look way at the top. Up here, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. There's one that's not just the top 1%, but the top 0.1%. Look how much the top 0.1, that's the top 1,000th of incomes. Look how much that's grown. It's grown far more than the entire bottom 50% has grown since 1990. So the American economy grows, the American economy expands, but very much of that expansion is going to the top 10%, and especially the top 1%, and especially the top 0.1%. Now, again, it's up to you what you think about whether people deserve what they get. But the raw fact is just that a shockingly low amount of money is held by the average American, which means the average American is on a personal level, in a really precarious position. There are studies that show that something like half of Americans have their lives seriously impacted by a bill of $400 or more, whereas someone at the top doesn't have to worry about stuff like that. So there's a material day-to-day problem here. Of course, there's just so many millions of Americans are struggling to get by, even as the pie grows bigger and bigger. But then again, it also does have this big picture economic impact of too many people with too little money to spend. So again, something to pay attention to. We looked at examples like the Progressive Era and the New Deal, where these issues were addressed largely through legislation and regulation. It's worth noting at this moment, everything's moving in the opposite direction. If you look at the big, beautiful bill that passed recently under the second Trump term, predominantly the benefits of that will go to, again, people in the top 1 to 10% of income holders. Many people, millions of people are going to lose Medicaid coverage over the next 10 years. So as of right now, there are no major forces in American life pulling things back towards a more equitable economy. Every force is accelerating the growth between the top and the bottom. Something to keep in mind. Think about politics. Again, we could spend so much time talking about the politics of this period, but I just want to focus on one particular topic, and this in some ways links us back to technology and culture, and that's polarization. Polarization just means people dividing into two poles, right? Like think about the North Pole and South Pole, people being pulled towards the ends. Now, it might sound like obvious, like you've lived in a polarized time. Maybe it seems obvious to you that like Democrats and Republicans, or the right and the left, are always really far apart, always hate each other, and always disagree about everything. It's actually not the case. There have been plenty of examples, plenty of moments in American history where there's quite a bit of overlap. I couldn't find a perfect image to illustrate this, but you can look back at, as I mentioned, like the Cold War period, like the late 40s, 50s, into the 60s. There's remarkable agreement between Democrats and Republicans on all sorts of really major issues. And in that period, the good politicians were the ones who helped bridge those divides and find compromises and move things forward, stuff like that. But really, since the 90s, the opposite has been happening. Now it's happened for decades, but it really has accelerated things since the 90s for reasons I can talk about. But look at this chart, right? In 1994, the overlap between Democrats and Republicans is pretty significant. 10 years later, it's a little farther. 10 years later, it's a little farther. I couldn't find one for 2024, but if you had one for today, it would be even farther. There's studies that show we're at record levels of political polarization right now. A lot of this is driven not because people strongly support their side, but because they don't like the other side. That's what the chart on the right shows, that there's something called negative polarization, where people are often more motivated by keeping the other side out than they are by actually supporting their side's policies or beliefs or actions or whatever. I would argue that the biggest factor for why this is happening goes back to what I said about technology and culture, and that's due to the technology of news and media. For, again, decades, people are reading the same newspapers. Now, there were certainly political polarized newspapers. You can date this back to the founding father generation. There were, hardcore Federalist newspapers and hardcore Democratic Republican newspapers and stuff like that. But in general, when you get to the 20th century, there's a lot of shared media, right? People are listening to the same radio news programs. They're watching the same 3 television stations. So they're very much experiencing the same reality and getting the same perspectives presented to them. And so the differences are kind of on the margins. I think the really key accelerant of the polarization what I'm talking about was in the 90s with cable news in particular, where cable news really offers people polarized visions of the world and very inflammatory stories that are going to aggravate those differences. And then, of course, that gets multiplied much, much more by the internet, and then much, much more again by algorithmically driven media that comes through our phones and social media and all that, where now the entire media ecosystem is designed to be algorithmically pleasing to you and make you engaged. And the thing that engages someone can often be negative, right? People are engaged by negative stories, conspiracy theories, stuff like that. And so now, if someone has this mediator of reality in the form of a smartphone, and that's really kind of determining what they experience, they're going to start to get vastly different pictures of the world, vastly different understandings of what's going on. And so people are literally living in separate realities. And so when that's the case, it's really hard to find ways to come together. I was talking with a colleague recently, and they said that, if aliens invaded, maybe that would bring us together. And I actually disagree with that. I think even if aliens invaded right now, people would probably polarize. I think you can think of COVID as an alien invasion. This weird enemy showed up. You can imagine a version of the COVID era where we all came together to fight a shared enemy, but it actually fractured American society more than almost any other event that had ever happened. So this is another area. I have no answers. I have no idea what's going to happen here. But I think a fundamental fact of reality right now is that shared reality is fracturing in the same way that, cable news and then the internet and then the smartphone fractured our entertainment. It's also fracturing our sense of political reality. And as long as that's the case, I don't know how the heck we're going to get it back together into any sort of shared purpose for the country to solve collective goals. I don't have answers here. This is just sort of food for thought to think about where the history we've studied in this course has gotten us by 2025. And then the final point I'll point to is for our Who is an American theme. I think the fundamental fact of this course has been a diversifying America, right? You look at America in 1865 at the end of slavery. Up to that point, it had been officially a country kind of by and for white people, where there's actual, human enslavement along racial lines. Of course, with the end of that, the story opens up a little bit, right? Black people gain citizenship. Of course, as we saw back in Unit 1, certainly not perfect or equal citizenship. And so one of the big stories has been to integrate African Americans into the kind of promise of the United States and the ideals of liberty and equality. You can say the same thing about immigration, right? Think about all those new immigrants coming in back in the Gilded Age and in the early 20th century. Same sort of thing. They begin as outsiders. Native-born Americans are often deeply opposed to their arrival, but over time, those groups, like in that case, Italians, people from Poland, people from Russia, over time, those groups become the insiders. And then when new groups come in, let's say from Latin America or from East Asia or Africa, then those groups become the outsiders. And this pattern just sort of repeats. So, and over time, the tent does tend to get bigger in terms of who is included as being part of America's promise. But at every moment, new groups tend to be resisted by the groups that have been here longer. And again, this is just an old story in American history. So being a diverse nation and a nation that's only going to become more diverse over time, this is going to have all sorts of effects on our politics. Obviously, the issues of race and immigration are really central to our political divide today. It's much more complicated than I can really get into in this little kind of sub lecture I'm doing this week. But it's certainly something to think about. If you think about America as by definition a nation of immigrants, as by definition sort of a multicultural nation, that challenge has been a really hard one for the United States to grapple with. And it's involved a lot of missteps and growing pains, a lot of harm and violence. And again, I think those challenges aren't going anywhere. The effort now is to kind of roll the clock backwards, right? Deport people, keep people out. But again, that effort too is highly inflammatory. So again, this is another one where I don't have any answers here. But I think it's just, again, if we think about where we are now is the culmination of where we've been during the semester of this challenge of being a diverse nation that's grappled with who do we include, who's being included, who's being excluded. I think we're living through with all of these themes an interesting turning point, right? Our relationship with diversity is in a turning point. Our relationship to the rest of the world is in a turning point. Our economic situation is at a turning point. Again, historians can't make predictions. What we can do is just try to provide some historical perspective. So hopefully, those of you who've been engaging with the course learn something that you can use to understand the world around you, whether that's understand where the economy is headed, what the American population looks like, how the United States should interact with the rest of the world. I'm just hoping to leave you with a little bit of food for thought, and my fantasy, I have no illusion that everyone's just going to remember everything they read in American Yop and remember everything I talked about in the lecture. But my hope is that somewhere down the line, something will be in the news, something will be happening around you, and you go, oh, I know something about this. Oh, I can see how it got this way and perhaps how we can move things forward. So thanks for listening this semester. I hope you learned something, and good luck with the end of the semester, and good luck with whatever comes after this semester. Thanks. Bye.